So I'm Nick Dirks. As Ian said, I'm the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences, but I'm a former academic and academic administrator. I was chancellor of UC Berkeley until 2017, and before that, the executive vice president and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia. My academic hat is as a historian and anthropologist, and so I come to the question of how you think about communicating science in an era of distrust, by also thinking about the sociological, historical, and anthropological context. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you today as we discuss a topic of growing importance, both for universities at large and for the community of scientists for whom issues of mistrust have become increasingly central in recent years, perhaps more so than at any time since the controversies around Darwin and creationism raged through the US in the early decades of the 20th century. The pandemic was a moment when we saw the almost miraculous capacity of science to develop vaccines and therapeutics in record time. But when we also saw an explosion of skepticism about the findings and recommendations of evidence-based science. We saw political polarization of a kind that we haven't seen for perhaps many, many years, and science, as well as universities, seem to have been caught right in the middle. So to discuss some of the issues that have led to our current predicament and suggest some strategies for how both individuals and institutions might work to restore trust and find better ways to communicate findings and even counter misinformation, I am joined by three distinguished panelists who I will introduce briefly, but also ask them each to say a little bit more about their own work and engagements with these issues when they respond to some of the questions and begin our discussion. First, Timothy Caulfield is the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy, Professor of Law in the School of Public Health and Director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta. He is the author of many works, scholarly as well as somewhat more popular, including The Cure for Everything, Untangling the Twisted Messages About Health, Fitness, and Happiness. Another is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything, When Celebrity Culture and Science Clash. And most recently, Relax, Damn It, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety. Timothy is also the host and co-producer of the award-winning documentary TV show, A User's Guide to Cheating Death. Second, Dominique Brossard is professor and chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and at the Morgridge Institute for Research. Her own research focuses on the intersection between science, media, and policy with the Science, Media, and Public Research Group, which she co-directs. She's an internationally known expert in public opinion dynamics related to controversial scientific issues. Brossard has a very professional background that includes experience in the lab as well as in the corporate world. Notably, she spent 5 years at Accenture and its Change Management Services division. She's also been the communications coordinator for the Agricultural Biotechnology Support Project 2, a position that combined public relations with marketing and strategic communication activities. And third, Wendy Bruin de Bruin, who is a professor of public policy, psychology, and behavioral science at the University of Southern California. Wendy's research aims to understand and inform how people make decisions about their personal health and well-being, and including during the COVID-19 pandemic. She's published more than 130 peer-reviewed publications on these topics, and she has also served on expert panels for the National Academy of the Sciences on communicating science effectively, as well as for the Council of the Canadian Academies on health product risk communication. So let's begin by asking each of you, perhaps in that order, to say a bit more about how you come to these issues and some of your initial thoughts about the biggest problems that we're facing today about how we communicate science to the broader public. So Timothy, I'll ask you to start. You're on mute.
First of all, I just think it's crucial to recognize that this is An absolutely huge issue. I like to use a little audio and some visual. There's misinformation absolutely everywhere all the time now. And it really is an incredible moment in history. I mean, look at this data. This is a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago, 5%. 5%. This was a large study, 19 countries involved. And only 5% of those surveyed thought that misinformation, the spread of misinformation, wasn't a big issue. In fact, most people put it up there with climate change as a significant issue that society is dealing with. And of course, as you noted right at the beginning, Nick, a lot of this is tied to an erosion in trust in science, and I think very importantly, an erosion in trust in scientific institutions, particularly universities. And so, you know, I really think, and I'm passionate about the idea that we've got to get institutions, particularly universities, to become more engaged in this issue. And I think we're starting to see that happen. And I think that that is absolutely fantastic. At my institute, we do a lot of research on the nature of misinformation, the spread of misinformation, but also what we can do as individuals, as professionals, as academics, and as institutions to push back against the noise. So I hope we can come back to those strategies at the end. But you know, just right off the top, I think you're right. I think this is one of the defining issues of our time. And holy cow, we got to get on top of it.
Thanks. We'll come back to you and ask you to say more about how you think we might get on top of it. But over to you, Dominique.
Yes. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much. And as a preface, I'd like to mention that I've served with the National Academy of Science on a number of projects that led to summarize the social science insight for policymakers on the ground in, like fighting COVID-19 and encourage preventive behavior. And we used a lot of your research as well when we did that. But the reason I'm saying that is because I would slightly differ from Tim on this issue. I think misinformation has always existed, but what has changed nowadays, and let's see if we think of how people were, very resistant to vaccines with measles in Britain in the 19th century. But what has changed is the digital environment. And I say a capacity to share information extremely rapidly with people that potentially share our own views. So I would say that one of the pressing issues that face us as educators, as scientists, is the notion of digital literacy, that, by the way, was raised in the panel just before us. And that notion that the way we teach science would change as well. Because as well with like an acceleration of, communication in the digital space, we also see a change in the scientific enterprise with science advancing at a pace that we've never seen before. And scientific discovery in the labs and so on, I would say, like with the advent of artificial intelligence and so on, going way faster than the capacity of science to deal with it. So how can we actually train our young generations to face not only, the issues linked to that digital literacy and science advancing very fast, because what's misinformation today was potentially a bad scientific study that was published yesterday. So how can we actually take into account that fast-paced environment, not only for science, but also for the digital environment? I think those are the challenge we face today.
Terrific. Thank you, Dominique. Wendy.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. So I have been working on the topic of science communication and how to best do it for decades, since the 1990s. And I think that there is a fundamental problem with a lot of science communication that has led to where we are today. So I'm going to highlight three things that have been a problem with science communication for a long time. First is that scientists, when we talk about our topic of expertise, we have a tendency to use very technical language. But that kind of jargon might be useful for communicating to other scientists, but it is not useful when talking to non-scientific audiences. And organizations that question scientists on topics such as childhood vaccination, climate change, COVID-19, those organizations don't use jargon and they do use everyday language. So if people look for information about a specific topic, they may prefer not to get the science communication. They may prefer the communication from the science deniers instead. Secondly, or relatedly, scientists have a tendency to want to show facts and figures that require a lot of numeracy and understanding of numbers. But most people prefer to hear about a topic. They understand information better if it's presented as a story or a narrative. And again, what you see that climate deniers or science deniers are much better at using stories than scientists are. And then scientists also often assume that they are the trusted individuals and the best individuals to speak about a specific topic, but people often tend to prefer to get information from people within their own community. So if scientists want to be effective at communicating, they should work with members from specific communities to make their communications heard.
Thanks, Wendy. Well, I think there are already a lot of issues that we need to discuss. The first one, perhaps picking up from where you left off, Wendy, is how, in fact, can science be communicated as science? That is to say, as a disciplined protocol of evidence-based work that is based on very technical, detailed knowledge, and that proceeds because, of course, it gets more and more technical, more and more detailed, and sometimes more and more complex. But how can we actually translate some of the findings of science in ways that doesn't take away from the actual nature of that science, but nevertheless does put it in a different set of languages that will be much more effective in persuading the public at large that they need to pay attention to science rather than to something they read on social media. Tim, you thought a lot about this.
I like to be an optimist on this. I always say that creativity wins. And I wonder if my colleagues agree with this. I do think that the pandemic has caused many people to get on social media, to be better about communicating, and as Wendy said, to start using stories, use narratives, use humor, use art. We can do this. We can do this. But there is a fascinating tension here, because one of the underpinnings, something that our team has studied for decades, is the tendency for scientists also to hype their work, right? To oversimplify their work. So it's sort of the sister problem to the jargon issue. Scientists have traditionally, and there's lots of good data to highlight this, hype the work or oversimplify it in a way that perhaps does not really reflect the nature of the research. So what we need to do is still keep it creative, still use those narratives, still make it digestible, but in a way that reflects the accurate science. And the good news, again, ever the optimist, I think we're starting to see this happen. You're starting to see biomedical journals using infographics as abstracts. I love that, because you know what? They're relevant to the scientific community, also great for journalists, also great for the public. You're also starting to see journals ask, and I'm sure this has happened to you guys, ask the researchers to do bullet points about what their research really means. I also love that. But we also have to remember to nudge people, don't hype the work, don't exaggerate it, because there's intense pressure to do that also, right? And lots of it really interesting research has shown, anywhere between, depending on the study, you look at 30 to 60% of all abstracts have hype in it. Then you start talking about press releases. Holy cow, it gets even worse. So there's this fascinating tension about making the work engaging, creative, digestible, but also making it accurate. But again, I'm going to use the word optimism again. I think it can be done, and I think we're starting to see it be done in a really effective manner. And as Dominique highlights, social media, it's really transformed the way science is communicated.
So, Dominique, just to segue from what Tim was just saying to questions around social media, I wonder, whether or not you believe that in addition to publishing abstracts and trying to communicate more honestly as well as more directly, I won't say simply, but more directly, the kinds of principal findings of scientific papers and findings. You think there should be a parallel process to push out scientific information on social media in ways that is not sort of an afterthought to try to explain something that is misunderstood or underappreciated, but as a simultaneous kind of publication strategy.
Definitely, Nick, and to build on something that that Tim was saying, I'm relatively optimistic as well, because I can see from the studies we've done and that we published very recently in PLOS and different journals on scientists at higher ed education. We did a big survey with 70 land-grant university. There's an eagerness from young scientists to actually be part of this conversation, and this is good news because the reality is also that the journalism environment has changed. Science columns and science writers are disappearing. So the traditional, translator that was there to actually in place to come from the lab to the public is really getting very small. So somebody has to occupy that space. And I would agree with Tim that I think, bench scientists and others have a role to play. This being said, though, I think there's also a danger to actually encourage everybody to communicate if what Wendy was saying is not taken into account. There is an art of science communication. People get trained to do so. There is, a lot of social science research that tells you how public opinion dynamics work. So I would encourage everyone to actually think very carefully before engaging in those enterprise to be aware of what they're doing, because it can backfire too. There's a lot of things that we know of how algorithms work, and how, you may end up, by amplifying something if you have the best intention, and maybe the hype can be part of the problem. So I would say, yes, indeed, we should actually encourage, communication, social media, but however, those that know what they're doing and understand the platforms and are trained to do so in a way that actually leads to positive outcomes.
So Wendy, to move on to you, I want to pose this question in relationship to some of the things that we saw in real time during the pandemic. In the early days, we were all, scrubbing down our grocery bags. We were worried whether or not even the mail or an Amazon delivery would carry with it the germs of COVID-19. We scrubbed down surfaces, and yet, we didn't wear masks or think about the fact that maybe it's not spread on surfaces. And of course, as time went on, we were told it wasn't spread on surfaces. It was through aerosol. It had to do with the air we were breathing. Masks were much more effective than carrying around our bottles of hand sanitizer and so on. And, there were people who were mystified by that switch and couldn't understand why we didn't know before. And of course, we saw in real time how science makes findings and learns new things about, in this case, a new virus. But it's a challenge in terms of how you narrativize that and explain the process by which science actually is conducted. Could you say a little bit more about your thoughts as to how you can bring together your strategies of, not using as much jargon, using stories, etc., to tell what is nevertheless a fairly complicated kind of story?
Yeah, so in 2006, several organizations brought together expert panels on pandemics and how to respond to pandemics, because there was already a concern back then that a pandemic might happen eventually. And one of the recommendations from that panel is that during a pandemic, you're communicating about some new disease that you do not yet know that much about as a scientist. And so the information that you have will keep changing as you're learning what this disease entails. And it may also keep changing as the disease evolves. So COVID-19 is still mutating. And so even now, what our recommendations about what to do about it might change. And so the recommendation from that panel was that during a pandemic, to be very clear that you're trying as hard as you can to understand what's going on, and you're going to give recommendations based on what you understand at that moment in time, but it will change, and flag that beforehand so that when the change happens, it's not a surprise. And I think what happened is that we had some communications coming out with more confidence than they should have been communicated, and then that led people to question the experts.
Indeed. Tim, what do you think about this? You've, obviously engaged in different kinds of writing strategies and for that matter, the documentary and so on, to try to engage and instruct the public about how science works. And you've also raised serious and interesting questions about when you get non-scientists talking about science, especially, of course, when you get celebrities. And others for whom sometimes, we turn to them and say, you have authority, people are going to pay attention to you. So, we'd like you to talk about, Matt Damon about water shortages in Africa and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts here?
On one side of the equation, it's who you're speaking to. I think it's really important to, and it can be hard, to be empathetic and to listen and to get a sense of what the questions really are. And I think especially now in this incredibly polarized environment, it can be easy to forget that. Even, I use the word debunking a lot, and that's even, it's not a great term because it sounds combative, it sounds unilateral. And so, but it's not going away. So I'm trying to own it, I'm trying to own the term. But we always have to remind ourselves to listen. So that's the individuals that are looking for the answers. But then when you're thinking about who should be transmitting this information, we do need to get creative. Now, I think we need to be careful. There's been really some interesting research on using celebrities in the context of public health and in the context of things like cancer screening, and it gets complex real quick because anytime I think, again, I wonder if my colleagues agree with this. I think the evidence tells us, and by the way, it's hard to study this well. We have to recognize that, but I think the body of evidence tells us that if the topic is very straightforward, don't smoke, wear a seatbelt, those kinds of messages, I think we should think about engaging and leveraging celebrities. As soon as it gets more complex, cancer screening and those kinds of, it becomes more challenging. I'll leave it with that. But I do think we need to ask ourselves also, who do people trust? Because one voice might really resonate with a community, and that same voice might just turn the other community off. And we see that with endorsements for political candidates, right? A lot of really interesting research around that. Does it work or does it hurt? So it may sound like a simple question, but it's not. But what we can do is we can learn from pop culture the tools that are used to communicate. So what I like to do is I like to use pop culture moments, right? To where the eyes are on the screens, the eyes are on the platforms. Use those pop culture moments to talk about what the science actually says, right? So when Aaron Rodgers, goes off on talking about homeopathic vaccines, that's a pop culture moment to talk about what the science actually says. So we can still use celebrity culture without necessarily engaging celebrity culture. Does that make sense? In order to get across the message. And the reason why I like that is that you're able to bring in the scientific voices and the scientific accuracy and have a little bit more control over the messaging. But look, I'm going to end by saying we got to get creative. We got to use all these strategies in order to get across the good message.
So Dominique, what do you think about that? And thinking about different kinds of strategies and social media you've talked about, do you agree with Tim that we have to, learn from celebrity culture, or from popular culture, I should say, in which celebrities play an outsized role?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I completely agree with Tim, and I think we need to learn. When we say we, I mean the scientific community. We need to learn from pop culture. We need to learn from marketing, advertisement, and so on. There's a lot that we know already, and we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. But I think something that Wanya and both and Tim said that's particularly important is like we shouldn't just assume there's science on one end and the public on the other, and there's scientists on the end and the lay audience on the other. We all part of that, like multidimensional public thing, and outside of our own expertise, we're still human beings that bring our own bias, our own background, our own personal experience, and so on to the table. And we may not always be the ones that should be communicate our own science. I think this is something particularly crucial. We always think that maybe the scientist is the best equipped to do so, but I think both of my colleagues say that here we're not always the best spokesperson. I mean, there's something we say in communication 101 is like, the trustworthiness of the messenger is actually almost more important than the content of the message itself, because the same message will be interpreted very different by different people depending on who says the message. So the key will really be to find the right spokesperson, and celebrity that may not be the best one in polarized environment. I mean, in the context of genetic engineering, we worked with priests in their communities. In the context of public health, with COVID, we worked with nurses in African American communities in Milwaukee, and so on and so forth. What are you trying to talk about? For what reason? What the outcome you're trying to achieve? And who's the best person to actually communicate what you're trying to communicate? Because I think, we always think that people need to know the science. Is that right? Maybe it's us that should know what the audiences think. Maybe we should be listening to their concern, and it would make us rephrase the questions that we have and, reconsider what we want to communicate. So I think literally, like if I would, two things that my colleagues said: trust, spokesperson, listen. And those are skills that you learn. And I know that somebody put in the Q&A where you learn those skills. There's a lot of programs, a lot of workshops, and I think hopefully people can take advantage of those.
So let's talk a little bit about some strategies that universities might be able to engage to be helpful here. Now, one thing that you just said, Dominique, which is, I think, incredibly important, is that there are trusted voices who aren't necessarily celebrities, but are located in communities, and they're people that are trusted by members of the public who interact with them and have a sense of their general trustworthiness. So that translates into, if they say something about something scientific, it's going to register and have an impact. But by the same token, you might then ask, what should universities do? Should we be engaged thinking about, we talk a lot about lifelong learning. Should we be, in fact, organizing all kinds of sessions where we do provide more background, more context, more science to the kinds of people who are trusted in their communities, and really try to persuade them that it's more than just getting the soundbite, but they actually have to come back to the university and we have things we can offer them. That's one question. Second one is to the point that some of you have been raising, which is that, not all scientists are great communicators, but should we try to make them better communicators? We're trying to make them better teachers. We now, take teaching very seriously at the time of appointment and promotion, and it's no longer just window dressing. But should public communication also be a skill that we both teach and reward? Wendy, what do you think?
I think yes. So I have good news. So for anybody who is puzzled by or overwhelmed by all the advice that we're giving today, that is, there is a social science of science communication. We know from a large body of research on this topic what works and what doesn't work. If you have an idea and we're not sure that it works, we can test whether it works. So social scientists can work with scientists in different domains to try out different communication strategies to see what works. So that's my first piece of good news, and I think universities can play a role here. The second is communication is a learned skill, and it is crucial to communicate well in the classroom and outside of the classroom. teaching scientists how to talk better about their expertise will make their teaching better and will make their public outreach better. And so that universities can play a role there too. So universities can teach scientists as part of their education to be better science communicators as early as grad school or undergrad. And then universities can also play a role by making public outreach central to promotion and tenure decisions so that it's actually rewarded instead of just tolerated as it seems to be at this moment.
Yeah, so I'd like to kind of pursue these questions because I think they're of real interest to the people who are tuning into this webinar, and I think we're all in universities looking for ways to help. On the one hand, we know that these kinds of communication skills are actually important because they are connected to teaching. They're also connected to being able to present effectively the kind of research you're doing to a public who may in fact be a public that includes investors and donors and supporters of that university and of the science that's being done there. We're talking here, however, about something that goes a little bit beyond the university in terms of a kind of public obligation, public outreach. And Tim, I know you've thought a lot about these issues and you've been working in this space for a long time. So what do you think are some really effective ways to leverage these kinds of institutional resources for the purposes of dealing with, say, the rampant misinformation that seems to be circulating in every conspiracy channel that media, social and otherwise, carries along with it?
Well, not everyone agrees with my position on this, but I think universities have a responsibility. These public institutions have a responsibility to be a source of accurate information. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be combative, right? So there's someone out there who's spewing misinformation about climate change, about GMOs, about vaccines. They don't necessarily have to call that individual out, but what they can be is a reservoir of accurate information that I always like to say that combines the aggregates the science in a responsible manner. And that's really, I think, one of the responsibilities of institutions, and to create messaging that is shareable, that is relevant to the diverse communities that they serve. And I do think it's one of their responsibilities. And the other thing I think universities can do, and I have this ready to go, is support the members in their community, as Wendy just said, that want to get out there. It's not easy. It's not easy. This was studies have shown that people who are out there fighting misinformation, for example, they get death threats, they get lawsuits. I found out today, you guys, right before I came out, that I won a lawsuit against someone who was suing me, an anti-vaxxer, for calling her an anti-vaxxer. It's exhausting, and studies have shown that if one of the number one indicators of whether someone is going to fight misinformation is if they feel like they have support from their institution. And that's something that universities can do. Make sure that they support their members who are out there fighting the good fight. And it's much worse for women and people of color, right? We need to support these communities. We need diverse voices out there, and universities are at the epicenter, right? The epicenter of knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. So I think it's becoming increasingly important for them to become part of the solution, because otherwise we're all going to feel silence.
Well, that's such an important point, and I'm glad you won the lawsuit, but I can assure you
literally right before I came on, I got the email from
congratulations. having been sued many times as an academic administrator. I know that it's a non-trivial event, so glad to hear that. But of course, part of what you're addressing there is the fact that universities are not universally well regarded these days, and everyone who's working within a university, and particularly academic administrators, I think are really puzzling about how to restore trust, not just in science, but in fact in the very idea of expertise. And of course, the kind of expertise that resides in, and in some ways is one of the major justifications for the university. Dominique, you've worked both in academia and outside, and I wondered if you had any thoughts from your perspective about how universities might be able to use this challenge, the one we're discussing today, to think more broadly about how to restore trust overall in the idea that expertise does exist and it matters.
Yes, and I think you do point to an important problem here. I think, like, honestly, I think what is important for us as scientists is also to think about the image we give of ourselves in the public sphere. So that notion that science is in a pedestal and there's the rest of the audience that's not, I think is part of the problem. I think universities are producing science that people feel is disconnected from their life, and they feel that universities are like a community of elitistic that are not, including the community. So I think that going back to what Wendy and Tim are saying, at the higher education level, we have a responsibility to show the communities that we care about them, which means that actually putting our expertise at the service of the community, which means listening to the communities, going there, like organizing an event where the citizens are listened to, and so on, with people that know how to do these kind of things. Obviously, we don't want everybody to do that. But the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for example, had a public speaker bureau where communities can actually ask professors to go, like northern Wisconsin, to talk about wolf management or whatever controversial issue they feel that they need to talk about. And they're eager to do that. They have an expert database for journalists to be able to interview people with the issue of the moment. But again, the scientists that are part of that expert database need to actually have some training on journalist-scientist interaction. That we haven't talked about that too. Science, like talking to journalists, is also an art, and you have to know how to do it well. So I think, part of restoring this trust is also show that we are willing to listen, because I think there is really big part of the problem feel that there's that notion of disconnect between our reality and the reality of the citizens that do not trust us, and show that we are part of the solution moving forward. And that starts by listening.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. And just on one of your points, I would say that, it's interesting that when I became a dean and then a chancellor, I was given media training by my institutions. And it was something that I was initially, kind of not that concerned about. I soon realized it was a critical skill. And in a way, it's something that all scientists, social scientists, and for that matter, humanists would benefit from in one way or another. So much of what we are dealing with is mediated, of course, through journalism and those writing from the outside. We're out of time just about, and I just wondered if we could go around and have any quick suggestions from each of you, starting with you, Wendy, of other things that we might have missed that we would recommend doing for individuals and for universities.
Well, so one thing that we've been doing in this panel is we've been focusing a lot on the people who have mistrust, who deny science, who deny information about COVID-19, who are climate deniers, and so on. But I think on a lot of topics, the deniers are still in the minority. So, for example, there's there's a Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll has found that a majority of people around the world is concerned about climate change, including 73% in the United States. The Pew Research Organization has, and other organizations have also found this. And yet a lot of climate communications are still trying to convince the climate deniers that climate change is real. And in doing so, sort of ignoring the motivated majority that actually wants to do something about climate change. So it's okay that we have these panels and that we worry about people who are lack trust, but there are a lot of people who do still trust universities and who do look to scientists for information. And so we should not ignore that motivated majority.
Thanks, Wendy. Tim and then Dominic.
I love that comment from Wendy, because we ignore the success stories. There's been a lot of, even with COVID, there are success stories when you look up about the number of individuals that were hesitant about the vaccine, at the beginning of the pandemic, when it first rolled out compared to now. You know, there are wins out there that we need to recognize. So I think that that's a great optimistic message, because it highlights that those are science communication success stories. You know, what we're talking about today really does work, and it probably feels like it doesn't. Like, you know, there's just so much noise out there. You're holding back the tide, but what we're talking about today, it's critically important, and it does work. And with that, I want to highlight our initiative. It's called #ScienceUpFirst. We've had already 1 billion interactions. It's a social media platform on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, where we're trying to fight misinformation across a number of domains. And it's publicly funded. Independent scientists at universities around the world are vetting our material. And we're trying to use evidence-based strategies, you know, empirical evidence by people like my colleagues to inform how best to communicate. So that's just one example, #ScienceUpFirst. I hope people come and join our team.
Thanks, Tim. Dominique?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to commend Wendy for her points. Like, a lot of good things are happening. And I think it's also our responsibility to talk about those good stories. We tend to talk, I mean, in the media, we also tend to see negative stories. We need to talk about also what works. At the community level, there's a lot of efforts on resilience in a wide range of issues, public health, climate change, and so on. And university need to be part of those conversation. But more broadly construed, what I would like us to live with is that idea that the big problem of the world, including communication science, is not going to be solved by one discipline alone. And I think all the disciplines together, from the life sciences, physical science, humanities, social science, we need to put our head together to actually work around these issues. And it's only that way, stories, art, and so on, that we can actually do a good job.
Well, that's a great point on which to end. I think, you know, we often invoke CP Snow at times like this and the idea of two cultures, but perhaps the nature of the challenge today is one that indeed does require both of our cultures, as it were, to collaborate and to merge into a context where we can begin to think together about how to deal with these issues, because they're not issues that will be dealt with by any particular discipline alone. And they will require thinking outside the box, I think, not only across disciplines, but across some of our institutional assumptions about what the university should do and what it shouldn't. I want to thank all three of you for a terrific discussion. Really enjoyed it. I hope everyone listening in did as well. And good luck, each of you, with the work you're doing. It's so important, and I commend you all for it. So thanks, and
Thanks, guys.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed, Nick, thanks for that panel. That was a great discussion. I really appreciate everyone joining in. But Nick, I'm going to borrow you for a few minutes because I want to make sure we get a chance to talk to you as well. You're a former dean of arts and sciences, as you mentioned, at Columbia, and the chancellor as well, a former chancellor of UC Berkeley. So I want you to see, you know, what you want to take away from that discussion. There were a lot of interesting points there about translating what science needs to be, how you communicate it, how you train folks to be able to communicate it. And we touched on a couple different things that higher ed can do. But what are the changes academic leaders can make to improve science, how it's communicated and understood, especially, as you mentioned, at this time when, you know, we've got, like, I was mentioning this earlier, about 55% of the public in terms of surveys think that universities have a positive effect on the country. You know, there's a very strong sense of skepticism. How do you kind of improve that communication at this time if you're a college leader or a university leader?
Yeah, no, it's a real challenge, Ian, and as you know, and we've talked before, people in the kinds of positions that I've had, both as a dean and as chancellor, are, you know, constantly being scrutinized and asked questions about, you know, whether the university is really living up to its public obligations and responsibilities. But I think this is certainly an important part of addressing that more generally. And I do believe that there are things we can do in universities that will move the dial in significant ways. First of all, when we train graduate students, I think, you know, you start really at the beginning. You could even begin with undergraduates, but I think, you know, once a student elects to pursue a subject in areas of science that will involve the idea of going for a PhD, should immediately start thinking about the importance of not only doing the science, but talking about the science. And I know there are centers for science communication and some of the activities we've heard about just now and the respective universities represented on the panel provide examples of that. Stony Brook has a famous center for science communication that Alan Alda has been involved with for many years. It's a really important example of that. And in fact, at the New York Academy of Sciences, we're giving him an award for science communication, the first such award for the Academy at a dinner we're holding in New York in a couple of weeks. But the truth is we have to embed that. And once you begin it, I think it will be easier to figure out where the other kinds of touch points are, where you would have to make sure that it gets recognized and built in to the strategies and trajectories of scientists at every level of their career. And that includes, thinking about, good communication as a skill you want to work on. When a scientist is an assistant professor, you want to take efforts to try to communicate to a broader public into account when you're assessing somebody for tenure or promotion. And again, I've seen as a dean that we pay lip service to certain kinds of public forms of outreach, whether it's in the humanities in terms of writing op-eds and being a public intellectual in one way or another, or in the sciences in terms of doing things that don't necessarily advance the science within the specific disciplinary scientific community that one operates in. But we can change that. And when you change incentives and when you change the way in which you evaluate our fellow scholars and researchers, you can make a difference. But of course, you can only do that if you really do have the kinds of resources that on each campus that will make a difference in that regard. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you reminding me of Alan Alda's work, but also there are these things that Chronicle has covered over the years about these different programs. I remember one was teaching improv to graduate students. They kind of help them just be comfortable making a pitch or talking about their work. But as you said, the systematic change to get that incentivized, and I think you used the word embed, I think that's much harder to do. And I wonder how hard it is, because we hear sort of similar conversations about teaching, how that needs to be better appreciated within tenure and promotion as well. And so how do you kind of balance all those things out? I think is a challenge for any university leader to start saying, here are all the things we want to incentivize. We want to be good at all of them, but it's hard to get faculty to, or hard to put that into the system, put it in place.
It's very hard, and of course, you don't want to add so many demands on our junior faculty that you make their lives even more vexing and difficult. And I think work-life balance is something that we also need to factor into our evaluative mechanisms and the like. But the truth is that if we do have the third pillar of what we claim to be as universities, places where there's research, where there's education, and where there's some kind of public outreach, public service, then we do have to take this more seriously. And at a time when, again, we all see it every day, misinformation is just, taking off and using every new available technology and mechanism to spread itself. And so at the very least, huge skepticism and confusion and doubt, and at most an outright rejection of the kinds of things that we saw during the pandemic and the kinds of things that we see around climate. We just began to talk about climate. That's such an important area. We're not going to really be able to be effective institutions, and of course, I think then the trust in us will erode further. The question about climate, though, is a really interesting one because again, what people will say in the public to try to discount some of the claims of those who are talking about our changing climate is that the science is not settled. And again, we alluded to this, in our discussion during the panel, where there are certain things that are settled, but other things that keep changing. In the area of climate, I think we not only have to learn how to tell stories better, but we have to actually learn how to talk about science more broadly in a way that can effectively deal with and help help the more general question of how you communicate issues around climate change, because science constantly has areas that are settled. We all agree that there are certain gravity exists. If you drop something, it's going to fall to the ground. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we accept as settled. And then there are the things that, of course, get involved in public policy debates and often are political discourse that, that hit on things that aren't as settled. But, in areas like vaccines, in areas like climate, there's a lot more that's settled than sometimes we're able to persuade the public really exists in that space. And again, to the last point that was made in the panel, I really do believe this is a challenge for humanists, people in the arts, people in the social sciences. They have to work together with scientists on this.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, what Dominique was saying, and you emphasized as well that there needs to be an interdisciplinary approach. Certainly, we've heard that in terms of communicating climate change and other issues. And as you said, this is an issue for the social scientists, the humanists, to kind of come together with their brethren over on the hard sciences, if you will, to talk more and perhaps come together. That was something I'd not heard, and I think it's something optimistic. And again, the pandemic was something that sort of shook things up greatly. The misinformation we've experienced, it's shaken us as well. And perhaps there's a movement here that to have more of the interdisciplinary communication and talking to each other and talking outwardly about these issues and how to communicate them better.
Yeah, well, I think, again, the pandemic has been a wake-up call for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of ways. But the climate issue is, I think, in some ways even bigger because it's longer term, and of course there doesn't seem to be any kind of endpoint that looks good right at the moment. But I'll maybe end with an invocation of a theorist who died just last month, Bruno Latour, who made a huge contribution to the history and sociology of science in his ethnographic studies of things like the Salk Institute in his early work, but who later in life became so persuaded of the importance of really addressing the climate issue that he began to mobilize a whole set of people in the humanities and arts and social and humanistic social sciences to think much more broadly about how you address questions where, yes, there are communities of scientists and communities of people taking science to come at, to produce what we take to be scientific fact and scientific truth. But at the same time, there are real truths and real facts that are fundamental to our appreciation of and understanding of the universe in which we live. And so this is a challenge, I think, intellectually as well as institutionally. And it's a kind of wake-up call in that sense for people across every part of our university ecosystem.
As you said, it's a broad and varied challenge, and as the panelists really expressed, to show the depth of the challenges, but also, as Tim was saying, it's something to be optimistic about, something that there are some movements afoot to kind of counter some of this. So, Nick, I really do appreciate your time today, and certainly appreciate the New York Academy of Sciences co-organizing this session today for the Chronicle Festival. Nick, thanks again.
Thank you so much, and it's great to work with the Chronicle. So all the best for the rest of the ChronFest.